So just to start off, as you guys can just tell that we are going to be recording this slideshow and this webinar. So just please keep your mic muted until the end. This will be placed later on our YouTube channel. So if you guys want to keep your video blacked out as well, later on I'll probably exit out of my screen. So if you guys don't want your face in there, we can cut that out. If you guys have any questions come up, feel free to write them in the chat box below and I'll try my best to give you an answer. But if you want to wait till the end, that would work the best. And then we'll try to have a little discussion at the end. If you have any technical difficulties or just can't hear me, please just let me know or Megan know in the chat, and then we'll try our best to troubleshoot. And then we would also just like to acknowledge that the East Kootenay region lay within the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and the Secwepemc people. And I'm currently in Fernie right now and feel very grateful to live in this beautiful area. So just important to acknowledge that. So to start off, a little intro on the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. So we're a not-for-profit organization that builds partnerships and supports collaborative projects in a natural and applied science way with policy research, outreach, and education to protect our forests, fields, gardens, waterways, and cities from the damaging effects of invasive species. We have a small team that works incredibly hard, both in the field and with the public and behind the scenes. We also run underneath a board of directors who are all local land managers. And none of this is made possible without our many funders and land managers that are involved. Our field team, who go out day to day to monitor invasive plant plots around the East Kootenay region, also complete villager sampling to ensure the invasive mussels, zebra, and quagga are not in our region. And then we also have our education team who are in charge of being present to the public across the East Kootenay region and be a source of information on this topic. You'll see us at school groups, special events, municipal offices, volunteer events, provincial parks, farmers markets, and partnering with other local not-for-profits to try to be a better resource for you. And then behind the scenes, we also have those who oversee the larger projects, working with contractors and special projects that ensure our beautiful areas get protected from invasive attack. They also ensure that we're running smoothly and efficiently as a team. And our whole team works towards the goal to create awareness and action in the East Kootenay region on the damaging effects of invasive species to our native areas, as well as create a better understanding on how we can affect change in the places that we love. So in this picture here, we have the education side and the field action side. So the education side, this is not our staff, but our lovely volunteers. This is a group from Lazy Lake who have been volunteering with us for a few years now, who have a great community setting, and we do awareness and weed pulls with them. The education side in general focuses on the public and public engagement. So we would not be here without all of our lovely volunteers. And I just want to make that apparent. Anyone who ever wants to volunteer with us, we love all of the volunteers coming out to all of our events, and you guys make it possible to keep spreading awareness. So we really appreciate our volunteers. And then we also have the field action team right there. We have a few of our staff, and then we have Hannah McIntyre, who is a part of the Ministry of Forests for the Peckham's Field Project. So these are like our partnerships and other members of the community that also help us with field action. So in this picture, we're looking at a plot on the Peckham's project to see the diversity of plant species in the plot, as well as if there's invasive species encroaching in the area. Right. So first off, because this is such a broad topic, I want to do some definitions just so that people can get more accustomed to what we are talking about when we say certain words. Just to make everyone more on the same page when we're talking about what's an invasive species and what's a non-native species and what's a native species. And then if you want more information on invasive species and the differences between weeds and wildflowers and invasives and more in-depth terminology on this topic, I would really recommend our YouTube channel, which has previously done webinars like this, which we will post as well on our YouTube channel. So you can watch these and learn more about this topic. So the three main classifications or definitions that we will kind of touch on is native species, non-native species, and invasive species. These ones are just the top three that are easier to communicate with everyone. So the native species are obviously the species that are from this location, that they've grown up in this area, they're within the ecosystem, they have the healthy feedback, they're within the food webs, they're from here. The non-native species are species that are not from here, but they do not have invasive qualities. And this one is very tricky when it comes to climate change, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. These non-native species are not from here, but they can pose a threat when climate change can come about. So invasive species is the last one, and these ones are the species that are not from here, but they pose threats to the environment, the economy, and or to us culturally, or to us physically. So with invasives, they can be one of these things, or they can touch on all three or a different variety of them. But when we are specifically talking about the threat to us, I'm talking about culturally in terms of these invasive species are now encroaching on indigenous territory, and they're spreading into traditional lands, and which can threaten the native species that have already grown here for years and years and years. And then also they can pose a threat to us in the way of being poisonous to us or animals. They can be damaging in the way of they can hurt you if you try to touch them in certain ways. So invasive species are the big bads that we're looking at. So a little bit more in depth, I'll give you some examples. So these are the native species. So these are the ones that have been here, they've grown with our environment, they're in our ecosystem. These species are important for our ecosystem health and biodiversity, which ensure a healthy environment. So in this larger image, we have the Western painted turtle. He is a native species that you can find in this area in healthy wetland habitats. He increases the biodiversity in a wetland. He's threatened by the invasive red-eared slider turtle as they outcompete their territory. And the red-eared slider turtle is the turtle species you can buy in pet stores, which people release, and they're actually carnivorous, which cause even more problems for our native habitat. So we want to make sure that this Western painted turtle is happy in his habitat. In the top right, we have yarrow. Yarrow is a beautiful, fragrant native flower, and it's very important for pollinators. This flower is threatened by invasive plants that take away its nutrients and habitat. Below that is grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are obviously a native species, but they are ecosystem health indicators. They tell us that the ecosystems are healthy and have higher biodiversity. Grizzly bears usually are in habitats that have higher amounts of biodiversity. They need a lot more things and habitat to survive and thrive. And their habitat is mainly threatened by invasive species when we're talking about this topic, as well as climate change. But grizzly bears themselves, when invasive plants encroach on their territory, because grizzly bears are omnivorous, they eat plants and they also eat animals, and those animals eat plants. So when the invasive species come and encroach into the native terrestrial plant habitat, it can really, really disrupt their food chain. And then below him, we got a northern leopard frog. And this is an endangered native species in the Western provinces. So he's endangered here in the East Kootenays. And this species is being threatened by habitat loss, which can be caused by invasive species spread, but also climate change. Next, we have some non-native species. So these were the species that are not originally from this area, but have become naturalized and are not a threat to other species or to us. So these ones are the ones that everyone always has a big question mark about, and that's totally fair, because how do we know if this is a weed or an invasive, or it's going to have damaging effects on us or the environment? So with dandelions in that larger picture, this one is one of the main questions that we get asked when we go and do education. When it was introduced, it was considered an invasive species because it grows everywhere and it can take over. But then now we have come to realize that this is actually an amazing plant for pollinators as well as animals who come out of hibernation. So dandelions, even though they're not from here, they actually do beneficial things to the environment, like provide a food source. Being one of the first flowers that pop up every spring, this is an excellent food source for the pollinators and for bears when they wake up from hibernation. Similar to dandelion, we have red clover. This species is much the same as dandelion. It's very widely spread and it grows very easily, similarly to dandelion. This species also has become naturalized, and it's an excellent species for pollinators as well as some larger species as well. But this one also doesn't pose a threat other than it just lives among all of our native plants now, and it can be a pest and a weed, but it is doing good things for the environment in some ways. The next one, we have the knapweed root weevil. This one is a very interesting one because this species is not from here, and it's doing beneficial things to our environment, but it was introduced into Canada as a biocontrol. So the biocontrol for knapweed is this knapweed root weevil, and it was released from Europe into Canada's ecosystem so that we can try to help stop the spread of knapweed. This one, in order to release a biocontrol, they have to endure a lot of testing and investigating to see how it'll interact with all of our native species in order for them to fully be like, we can release this out into this natural area. So this one is non-native because it's doing good things to the environment, but it's definitely not from here. And then we have tomatoes. So tomatoes are genetically modified fruit, but these are definitely not native to Canada. Lots of garden variety plants are non-native, such as lots of produce, but you do actually have to be aware when you're buying from the stores for growing your own plants, because it's not illegal to sell invasive plants from markets and garden centers. So a great resource for this area is Grow Me Instead, which is a plant-wise resource which can help you to pick what you should and should not grow in your garden. Tomatoes, they're beneficial for us and they're not posing a threat to the environment, but they're not from here, so we label them as non-native. And then all that being said, lots of invasive species have come into our region because of this lack of education on what can get out of hand quickly. Some non-native species can be directly impacted by change in climate, which can spark invasive qualities in the plant, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then we have invasive species. So these are the big bad species, the ones that are having damaging impacts to the environment, the economy, as well as us and culturally. So in the larger picture, this one might be familiar to you. This is spotted knapweed. This is a species that people get accustomed to very quickly in the world of invasive species. It was introduced from Eurasia and has now spread across Western Canada, very quickly impacting our plant communities. And this plant is allelopathic. So allelopathic plants mean that there's a chemical that seeps out of its root system into the surrounding soil, which can kill other plants or make it inhabitable for native plants to grow. And this plant has a very, very high dispersal and seed viability. So it disperses thousands of seeds every year, and they can last for up to 15 years on the soil. And this plant can also be very damaging because of the allelopathy. This plant can create erosion and can be a very high fire risk due to its massive skeleton and the erosion that this plant produces. And then we have the American bullfrog. So on the top right, American bullfrogs, this species is native to Eastern Canada and the Southern United States and was originally brought to Vancouver Island as a food source. They're huge. They're very much known for their large size. So people consume their frog legs in some parts of the world and in North America. And when they were released, they were quickly taking over wetlands and posed a huge threat to our native wetland communities. Currently, we don't actually have any known occurrences of these big frogs in the East Kootenays, but we must remain diligent in identifying and being aware of American bullfrogs, that you can clearly identify them by their large size and their odd sound that they make, just so that we ensure that our wetlands here remain protected and have higher biodiversity. Below the bullfrog, we got Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is one of the most damaging invasive plants in Canada. This plant can reproduce from just one part of the plant material, the leaf, the stem, the roots, any little part of the plant, and they can create new stalks of the plant. And this was originally brought here as a garden variety because it's similarity to look like ornamental grasses or bamboo. But please do not buy this plant. It can actually cause property damage, and it can, pardon me, break through concrete and your foundation. So it would be really bad to have this plant on your property or around your property, and it can cause a lot of damaging effects. And then lastly, we have the infamous zebra mussels. So zebra and quagga mussels pose a huge threat to us, the environment, and the economy. So they can do all of the above effects, negative effects. As once they're introduced into an area, they are impossible to be removed. Their babies are microscopic, and they will attach to any hard substrate and grow and grow and grow and take over. And they filter feed all the nutrients out of the water, which take it away from native populations. And they also cause so much economic damage as well from the amount of money that goes into trying to control this species. So the other part of this presentation is climate change. So this is a very, very broad topic, as I said before, that touches on so many different aspects of our Earth. We will be talking about climate change interacting directly with invasive species in particular. But first, we'll start off with what we categorize as climate change. So climate change, when we're talking about climate change, it's the long-term shifts in the temperature and weather. And for sure, some of these shifts can be natural from solar cycles, but the rapid change in our climate has been human caused. The difference between weather and climate, so weather is short-term and climate is long-term. So the weather is what's happening today and this week. So it's nice and hot and sunny, and there might be a chance of thunderstorms. But the climate is the overall trends of the weather over a long period of time. So for sure, climate does change over time from a variety of different factors, such as solar flares, but many studies have shown that drastic climate change that we have been witnessing has been human caused from things such as greenhouse gas emissions. So the consequences of climate change. So there's lots of consequences to invasive species and climate change. So consequences for climate change, we're talking about more like the drastic changes in the climate, increased occurrences of natural disasters such as intense drought, water scarcity, severe forest fires, rising sea levels, flooding, the melting of polar ice, catastrophic storms, and in turn, climate change decreasing biodiversity, but then it feedbacks in. So the main question here is, does climate change impact invasive species, or can invasive species cause negative impacts on the climate and worsen climate change? So this is kind of a trick question a little bit. The larger impacts of climate change are definitely drivers of invasive species spread, but invasive species do also make the situation worse. So the answer for this one is both. In this image, we have a forest fire, and we also have a picture of cheatgrass. So we will be able to see in my examples how they relate with each other, and how cheatgrass can impact forest fires and climate change, and how climate change and fires can affect cheatgrass. So first off, climate change can worsen the effects of invasive species. So more frequent and extreme weather events, such as flooding and drought, can stress native populations and increase movement of invasive species. This can happen terrestrially on land with major flooding events. Maybe after all the flooding in BC, for example, that happened last year, this is something that needs to be monitored and keep in mind, because as these flooding events happened, they could have stressed the native populations, and they could have brought the seed bank from other invasive species outbreaks into new areas as well. And this can also happen with shipping companies. So with the melting polar ice caps, it's creating new pathways for transport, which is good for trade, but it's not good for invasive species because it allows more pathways for hitchhikers to come from other areas of the world and be brought here. So we also have a change in climate can directly impact the life cycles of some species, thus increasing their ability to spread. And this one, we have a nice little case study talking about pine beetles and how the climate change has impacted their life cycle and gave them invasive qualities, even though they are technically a native species. So this can happen with native species and non-native species, and that's why we want to keep this one in mind. And then climate change can create favorable conditions in which invasive species will thrive and increase their movement. So in terms of rainfall, temperature, and humidity, when all of these things change, it can create favorable conditions in which some invasive species will thrive and increase their movement. And it can also decrease the favorable conditions for which our native species can thrive. So invasive species have a variety of different traits in which make them strong. So being highly adaptable and thriving under harsh conditions are some of the reasons why invasive species thrive. And as climate change changes, it can just create more of a habitat for invasive species to outcompete the native species. Another aspect is climate change can also increase the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which also decreases the effectiveness of herbicide. So for certain herbicides to work, they have to be under certain conditions, and you have to use certain herbicides for certain plants, and certain plants need certain things to survive and thrive and to be killed off. And so as the carbon dioxide levels rise, this can actually increase herbicide resistance. And herbicide is one of the 4 control methods of invasive species. And in some cases, it's the only effective ways to control the invasive species, just like Japanese knotweed. So this would be very, very difficult in a changing climate to start keeping in mind when we are using herbicide and doing control methods for invasives. Another topic is climate change affecting non-native species. So climate change may also affect sleeper species. So these are non-native species that previously did not have invasive qualities because they had some limiting factors, such as the climate that they lived in. And now, because of the climate is changing, it's giving them the ability to thrive, and their invasive qualities are coming out because climate change is working in their favor. And this increases their habitat, and now they can outcompete the native species. Identifying these sleeper species is integral in understanding on how we can stop and slow down the rate of which invasive species are attacking vulnerable native populations, and gaining more of an understanding on sleeper species and different invasive qualities that some plants have, or animals as well, will help us investigate how climate change will affect certain populations and areas, and what species will thrive and which species will be outcompeted. So if you look at the graph, this is over time, this sleeper species has been limited by unfavorable climate. And then as climate changed, climate became favorable and the species has awakened. And so over time now that climate has changed, the abundance, the rapid population growth and invasion has drastically inclined, and there is a drastic population growth, and thus the cost of control is super costly now because it's gotten out of hand. And then as well, invasive species can also make the climate change dilemma a lot worse as well. So with this one, most invasive species are highly resilient, and as such can survive in a variety of ecosystems. So invasive species have the ability to create monocultures, which take over the native plant habitat. As the climate changes in some locations, warmer and drier climates will be more frequent in some areas. And in these areas, the invasive plants can act more as fire fuel and can create more intense fires in the area. And that's just making the whole situation a lot worse. So why should we care? So climate change and invasive species are very similar in the way that they cause environmental, economic, and social damage. Climate change can cause a whole lot of damaging effects on the environment and our local spaces, and they cause a whole lot of economic issues trying to fix all of the problems that entail in a changing climate. And then invasive species also cause environmental, social, and economic issues as well. So combining the issues from climate change and invasive species can cause a whole lot of problems that directly impact biodiversity loss. Specifically, environmental issues for both of them, climate change and invasive species. It can threaten native species and decrease biodiversity in the ecosystem. Climate change creates unfavorable conditions for native species. And then invasive species being introduced into areas also threatens the native species populations. So they just both go down. Biodiversity is going to decrease. For economic, for invasive species, the control is very, very costly. And some species can cause property damage, just like that Japanese knotweed we were talking about. When we're talking about climate change and the economic damage, it's quite vast because there are so many underlying topics of climate change. But specifically with invasive species, as the amount of invasive species that can now come in and encroach on those native spaces, the cost of control is very, very drastic. So that's a bad negative feedback there. And then it also socially and culturally isn't good for us either, because all these native species that have been here that are now being affected by climate change and invasive species, they're combining their negative impacts, and we are going to have a lot of issues come up from that. So now I'll get into some examples. So these topics are very, very broad for invasive species and climate change. And I can't touch on all of the different impacts because there are so many different case studies that are being found and have been found on how these topics combine. So I'll only touch on a brief few examples, but if you're interested in more, there's a lot of great resources to do so. So the first example that I'll talk about is whirling disease. So pathogens and parasites and invasive species kind of work hand in hand, and they also can interact a lot with climate change. So whirling disease is from a parasite, which uses an invasive worm as a host, and they can greatly damage our native trout populations as this disease attacks salmonoid populations, so trout, salmon, and whitefish. As many as 10,000 tubifex worms, so the worms that host the parasite, can be found in 1 square yard of a muddy river bottom. So lots and lots of infected worms. And then the invasive parasite can greatly impact the mortality rate of smaller size trout. So it can kill off up to 90% of a population in a wetland. This parasite has been found in the Old Man River watershed, neighboring our Elk Valley watershed, as well as within the Bow River. And the Bow River is super, super close to Radium and Invamere with a lot of travel. And so we want to make sure that people have an understanding on what whirling disease is and some aquatic invasive species so that we can reduce the spread. Luckily, it's not in BC yet, but we want to make sure that we're remain diligent on that. And this parasite, what it does, it invades the cartilage of the fish skeletal system and thus impacts their nervous system. So you can tell that the fish are infected by it by a whirling swimming behavior. And then usually there's a discoloration of the fish. Sometimes it's a different colored tail. Sometimes the whole tail is black. And then the deformation, which is the most clear sign of it in the skeletal structure in the fish. So you can see in the larger image that the top fish is one that's not infected, so has a healthy skeletal system. And the bottom picture, you can start to see that discoloration. and the tail is becoming a little bit black, and it is starting to get the kink in it. And in the bottom image, you can really tell that the skeletal structure of the trout has been deformed. And this is causing that whirling structure in the swimming behavior. So whirling disease versus climate change. So whirling disease and how it interacts with climate change is kind of interesting. I picked this topic to try to, for my own personal investigation, to see how climate change and whirling disease kind of interact, but also because knowing that warming water from climate change can increase parasite and pathogen movement, how would that like affect whirling disease? So no surprise here, as temperature changes and shifts with climate change, some areas around the world will also be warming, creating hotter, drier climates, and some areas will be cooling as well along some coastal areas. And BC will be seeing trends towards the former, more warmer, drier climates in the interior of BC. As the temperatures of the air increases, so does the water temperatures. So the warming water can increase parasite and pathogen movement. So some studies are noting that pathogens and parasites are more adept of survival in warmer climates, and they'll thrive in warmer climates. And thus climate change, when they spike the water temperature, they can also spike some of these sites that have these parasites and pathogens in them and make them move more rapidly throughout the population that they're affecting. Whirling disease may or may not react to the warming water. It was kind of unclear in the studies I was looking at, but it is something we really do need to keep in mind about our wetlands and our waterways, as this is definitely a trend that we might start to see. And climate change already does impact native fish populations by impacting their habitat. So whirling disease on top of that, or other pathogens and parasites, really would kill off more biodiversity, which is not good. In these pictures, the top image, you can see just another example of how the parasite can affect the skeletal structure of the fish, and those ones have very drastic bends in their tails. In the middle picture, that is actually a microscopic image of the actual virus itself, the parasite. And then in the bottom image is actually a map of Alberta. And on the bottom left corner is where BC would lie. And the red areas are infected watersheds of whirling disease. So the Bow River and the Bow River watershed runs from Banff all the way past Calgary. And the Old Man River watershed runs from the Crow's Nest Pass all the way even east of Lethbridge. And so this whole area, which has a high amount of travel into BC, we have a high risk of infection. But when we stop at the boat cleaning stations, this is also what they are protecting against as well. Another example, as we were talking about in that main question of whether or not invasive species affect climate change or climate change affects invasive species, we have got an invasive terrestrial, which is cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is one of those species that gets impacted by climate change by being able to adapt to different climates and having a high survivability rate in dry soil, but it also negatively feeds back into climate change. So cheatgrass, which is also called downy brome, is an invasive species that was commonly used for landscaping because of its nice little purple hue that you can see in that right photo. And this grass species is identified as a brome grass with a purple hue through the stem and into the seeds at certain times of the year. You can see it very commonly along roadsides and areas that have high disturbance. So how does cheatgrass affect and impact climate change? And how does climate change affect and impact cheatgrass? So when we said cheatgrass impacts climate change, but also makes things worse, this species can take over fields and natural areas very quickly after disturbance. So after fires, cheatgrass can easily sneak in and take over an area, but also cheatgrass can cause fires as well. It changes fire regimes as the plant material dries out very quickly. The root system is very shallow and fibrous, making it very flammable if it's sparked. So this can be a very big problem along our roadsides and our trail systems that we need to pay attention to, because as this plant is very highly resilient, it can create monocultures very quickly, and it's not very picky on where it should reproduce and thrive. And because it's high seed reproduction and dispersal, it can cause lots of issues. One of them being diminishing our native grassland biodiversity. This is very bad for climate change and vice versa. Biodiversity actually increases productivity of an ecosystem and helps keep it healthy. So as biodiversity is lost and maybe even monocultures take over, this can cause problems in our carbon cycle. So in the photo, in the top right, that's actually a sagebrush field that actually was invaded by cheatgrass. And fires will happen with or without cheatgrass, but the reason why cheatgrass is bad is it actually can create a more intense fire just because of that shallow root system, and it has a lot of dry, dead plant materials, and it totally takes over. So you can see at the bottom photo, that's actually when it's at its purple tone. So you can see that purple hue, and it's fully taken over that whole roadside. And so that could be very dangerous, because if someone throws something out of their car, or something happens where their car is overheating on the side of the road, this can start a whole grass fire on the side of the road and into the trees. And burning it won't do anything because it is very highly heat resistant. And as the seeds are being transported by cars and everything, it just creates more of an issue. Another invasive terrestrial that we have is purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife should not be confused with the native fireweed plants or invasive Dame's rocket. They look quite similar, but once you have them all beside each other, they're very, very different. And purple loosestrife is known for its wetland habitat. This was an escaped garden plant, which has now spread very easily throughout some wetlands in BC. And this species can be awful for our native wetland species, as it has a dense woody root structure that produces many fibrous roots off the woody portion. And this species chokes out the habitat and outcompetes our native wetland plants. And it encroaches on the habitat of those species right below the surface of the water, making it harder for them to move around. So when we were talking about that native leopard frog that is endangered, species that are similar to purple loosestrife or wetland invasive species, they can encroach on their habitat and create a little bit more difficulties for them to move around within their habitat. And then how does purple loosestrife and climate change interact? So this species produces thousands of seeds every year. And because their habitat choice is beside water, their seeds can disperse very, very easily and create different infected sites across the whole wetland, or even through ditches and waterways, and they can spread very, very fast. And with climate change, as we have more catastrophic storms and we have more localized flooding, a plant such as this would actually thrive because as it starts to flood, it can actually lead to new pathways for the flower to spread and infect. So if we're getting some of the big flooding from the site that is in this picture, and it brings it over into some of our other native habitats and creates other wetlands and moves through ditches, it can just bring all those seeds to everywhere it goes and create new infestations, which would decrease habitat for native species. This one is a very interesting one. This is a potential aquatic invasive. This one is just recently came out into the news. It's a non-native species right now, but it definitely has invasive qualities and has the potential to be very destructive in our environments. So we're seeing some up and coming invasives in other provinces that have the potential to spread in BC and destroy our food chain. So this is the freshwater jellyfish. It's also called Crespa decusta sowerbee. It's native to China, and it was brought out here as an aquarium pet in local pet stores. And when people are dumping their aquatic waste, they're not realizing that the jellyfishes are still alive and they're reproducing very quickly in some lakes and waterways in Quebec and Ontario. Some scientists have actually found an occurrence of these jellyfish and other freshwater jellyfish on the Bowen Islands in Killarney Lake. So that's the little map there of Killarney Lake that's on Bowen Island. It's like right in the middle of Bowen Island. And that species of jellyfish, it consumes large amounts of microorganisms, which our native species need to survive. So that's what their negative impacts on the environment is. They just consume, and they take over. They prefer warmer climates. So with climate change and the warming waters, they can greatly impact the rate of survival. If our freshwater lakes keep warming, they'll be able to survive more easily. So to continue that, in that previous photo, there was a comparison I show you right on the bottom left. It's smaller than a quarter, so it's very, very small. And it is very similar in a way to the pathogens and parasites because they prefer warmer climates. And so as water temperatures are rising, they're creating more favorable conditions for spread. And they consume all the nutrients that our native species need to survive. So concerned scientists are questioning that as the water's warming, what these new exotics can and will take over the habitats and food sources of our native species. How will they affect our native areas? And you can see on the top right photo that those are little jars that a scientist who found them in Killarney Lake, he trapped them just to study them, and they are so small. And he stated in his article that you would think that there was only going to be a couple of them, but then when you get to these sites, there's actually a lot, like hundreds of them. So they would spread very, very quickly in those warmer climates. This one is a very interesting one, the invasive terrestrial mountain pine beetle. So mountain pine beetles are a big topic in Western Canada because this is actually a native species to Western Canada, but it's rapidly spread beyond its historical range in recent years. And this is because the winters have been warming. So the longer trends have been seeing that our winters are not as cold as they used to be. And this species of beetle was previously killed off every winter. About 98% of their population every year would be killed off by the winter. And now that our winters are warmer, this is not happening anymore. And so this native species is actually acting invasive and has been threatening pine trees across Canada. And this is bad because our healthy forests are carbon sinks. So when we're saying a carbon sink, it's taking large amounts of atmospheric carbon, and they are offsetting the carbon. They're absorbing it all and then putting out oxygen and other atmospheric gases. But then with a mountain pine beetle infestation, it actually turns this now carbon sink into a carbon source. And because all of these mountain pine beetles are actually killing off the trees, then now all that stored carbon that's within the tree is being released into the atmosphere now. So we're actually feeding into the greenhouse gases and further accelerating climate change now. So in that left photo with the actual pine beetle, it's a blown up photo, but these beetles are very, very small. They're about 5 millimeters in length, so very tiny. And then in the bottom photo, you can see the damaging effects that these insects have on a forest. And you can really see this if any of you have traveled anywhere in the Rocky Mountains, actually, from the Galton Range all the way up to Jasper National Park in Alberta. The forests are becoming orange and brown, and that's because these pine beetles. And a lot of the efforts to get rid of them and to help offset this change is to burn these forests and to spot burn some areas so that the pine beetles stop spreading. So another effect that these pine beetles have, so their reason and how they're destroying these trees. So this species is definitely a native species gone wrong. It can kind of relate to what we were talking about, the sleeper species function. So those non-native species that were limited by factors. So the pine beetle was limited by the cold winters. And then now, because climate's changed, they're getting these invasive qualities and their numbers are jumping up. That's very, very similar. So this species actually carries a fungus that destroys and infects the trees. So you can see in the top right photo, the little diagram. So an adult carrying the fungus, it's a boring species of beetle. So it'll bore into the trees and it releases the fungus, which starts to spread. The fungus infects the tree and attacks the xylem and phloem transport systems of the plant. So if you don't know what xylem and phloem do, they're basically the transport systems to bring the water and minerals from the roots up to the leaves and throughout the plant. So that's xylem. And then the phloem brings nutrients and foods down from the leaves throughout the plant and through to its root system. So this fungus halts these functions and thus kills the tree. And it leaves that blue stain in the trunk. So you can see that in the bottom right photo. And it destroys our forests. So this feeds right back into the climate change cycle by producing more carbon instead of cycling it into oxygen. But it also increases fire risk by producing more fuel for fires to spread into our forests. And it also decreases the biodiversity. And that's a very, very important and common theme in this whole topic. Climate change and invasive species are in the top 5 reasons for biodiversity loss. So we want to keep that in mind too. Another really quick point to keep in mind as well is that native species habitat is also greatly impacted. So native species have to shift their home ranges to adjust to climate change and to invasive species. So when we're talking about climate change and the idea of invasive species moving from one place to another, this will change. So invasives are invasives now, will have reduced impacts over time, but then new exotic species will become invasive and create new impacts. And then native species will also be impacted in a similar way, because they are in search of suitable conditions for their own survival. So the movement of native species to adjust their distribution to climate change should not be confused with what we were saying about invasive species. So the difference is that the native species have to range shift, are just going to adjacent areas, and they're shifting similar species that have similar evolutionary history, which cause less damaging effects than invasives, whereas invasives are coming from somewhere far away that don't have any predators or preys that are used to them, and then they come here and they can thrive even more. These native species are just moving for their own survival. So it's a little bit of a difference. So an example of this would be the white-tailed deer populations in Canada that carry pathogens and diseases that also affect moose populations are moving more northward into moose habitat. And then moose are realizing that they also need to range shift, so they're going more northward as well. But that also puts pressure on the critical habitat that caribou survive in. So it's a kind of a weird cycle there, but we don't want to get it confused with an invasive species versus just native species adapting to change. And then finally, I know a lot of this material can be kind of depressing because it seems like it's a very large topic that is really out of control, but there's so many things that we can do to make an impact in our own community as well as communities around us to complete these actions. And we can move towards having healthy backyards and ecosystems and climates. So these small behavior changes is what actually does bring about more change and creates more of a knowledge base that we can all lean upon. So the resources that we like to use and share are really good for invasive species management. And then the main one for climate change management would be just to keep educated on the whole topic. So the Don't Let It Loose on the top left corner, this one pertains to pet owners. So things such as red-eared slider turtles, goldfish, the jellyfish we were just talking about, bullfrogs. These are all species that do not belong in our environments. And if we educate ourselves and be responsible pet owners, we can understand why we should not release our pets into the wild and what consequences will be there if we do so. And then next to that, we got Play, Clean, Go. And this is another great slogan to remember. We all love going to our favorite outdoor places. We all have those fun activities we enjoy. Ensuring that we're looking after our equipment and cleaning everything properly, such as our bikes, ATVs, boots, pants, everything like that. We can actually prevent so much spread of terrestrial invasives. And then we also got Buy Local, Burn Local. This pertains to invasive insects such as the pine beetle and other invasive bugs that can be hiding on our firewood. Ensuring that where we're getting our firewood is where we're burning it will stop the spread in terms of bringing it from one area to a drastically different place that still has pine trees. And then we also have Plant-Wise and Grow Me Instead, which I previously mentioned. Lots of invasives come from garden centers, so we need to be a little bit more aware of what we're buying and where. Apps like Seek and iNaturalist, BC Wildflower, Alberta Wildflower, there's so many apps and books that you can use to determine what plants you should and should not put in your garden and see if they will be invasive. So I would use those resources if you like to garden. And then Clean, Drain, and Dry is the new up and coming one in Western provinces, as we do not want the invasive mussel species to come here. This is tremendously helpful for aquatic invasive, things like mussel swirling disease, plant material, other critters like the jellyfish that can be very hard to see on your boat. Ensuring that your whole boat and water equipment, so your fishing gear, your paddle boards, your motorboats, everything is clean, drained, and dried will help stop the spread. And then definitely invasive species and climate change are directly impacted. So as we said in the previous slides, if this topic goes unchecked, the interactions can cause drastic changes very quickly. And there are many examples of this topic, but I only briefly highlighted a few. So these small behavior changes and education, this will actually drastically change our perspective on how we can affect more change on the topic of climate change and invasive species. So if you guys have any questions, you can unmic yourself or you can write in the chat box. If we can't give you a full answer, I will try my hardest to get some good references for you. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask right now. And thank you so much.